Orchestrated narrative rewrite. Với hook mine. Dialogue dung. Pacing yang. Clara Ashworth hit the dirt of Main Street face first and didn't make a sound. That was the part that silenced the whole town. Not the crack of her husband's hand. Not the way her body dropped like something discarded. But the silence after. 30 people on that boardwalk. 30 people who knew her name, who'd sat beside her in church, who'd eaten food she'd cooked at their tables. Not one of them moved. They looked at her the way you look at a dead bird on the road. Briefly, then away. Then, one stranger stepped off the boardwalk and walked toward her, and everything in Ridgefall changed. If this story already has you, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. Subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens to this woman is something you need to see through. Now let's go back to where it all began. Back to the morning of the ledger and the number that started a war. The morning had started with numbers. Clara was up before dawn, the way she always was, sitting at the kitchen table with the household ledger open in front of her while the coffee worked itself up on the stove. The house was quiet. Holt wouldn't be down for another hour. She had 60 minutes of something close to peace, which was 60 minutes more than some days gave her, and she intended to use them. She wasn't looking for trouble. She needed that understood, even if only by herself. She was checking feed costs against what Jacob Pruitt at the general store had billed them last month, because Jacob Pruitt had a habit of rounding up, and Holt never looked closely enough to catch it. And Clara had been doing this particular math since she was 12 years old in her father's accounting office in Missouri. It was reflex. It was the one thing in this house that still felt like hers. That was when her finger stopped on the page. Not feed costs. Not household expenses. A transfer. $80, drawn against the county land account, signed in Holt's handwriting and dated 3 weeks prior. $80 to a name she didn't recognize. Carter and Associates, Silver City. Clara sat very still. She knew the county land account. She'd built the tracking system herself 2 years ago, when Holt had first been appointed deputy and the sheriff's paperwork was a ruin. She'd organized every file in that office, alphabetized every contract, flagged every error. She knew what money was supposed to move through that account, the way she knew her own heartbeat. $80 to Carter and Associates was not supposed to be there. She should have closed the ledger. Her hands knew it before her mind did. Her fingers were already moving to turn the page back when something stopped her. Maybe stubbornness. Maybe the part of her that her father had built. The part that said, a number is a number, and a lie in a ledger is still a lie, no matter whose name is on the cover. She turned back further instead. 6 entries. 14 months. Small enough individually that you'd miss them if you weren't looking. If you weren't the kind of person who'd been trained to look. 2 here, 3 there. Once a single dollar that felt almost contemptuous in its smallness, like someone testing whether the room was empty before they started talking. Clara heard his boots on the stairs and closed the ledger with hands that had gone absolutely steady, which was what her hands did when she was most afraid. Not shaking, not fumbling, but still and precise, the way a clock goes still right before it strikes. She stood and moved to the stove and poured his coffee, and when Holt Deering walked into the kitchen, she was just a woman making breakfast. "Morning," he said, not looking at her. "Morning," she set his cup down. "Biscuits in 10 minutes." He pulled out his chair, that scrape against the floor that lived in her spine, and sat and opened the Ridgefall Courier. He'd already been outside, already spoken to someone. That was how Holt operated. He was the deputy sheriff of this county, and he moved through information the way other men moved through rooms, always knowing which door led where before he touched the handle. Clara cracked 2 eggs into the skillet and kept her back to him. "You were up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." "What were you doing at the table?" The question came down on her like a boot on thin ice. Careful. Testing. "Mending," she said. "My blue skirt has a hem coming loose." A moment of quiet. She listened to him drink and turned the eggs and did not let anything change in her shoulders. "I need to go into town this morning," she said, because moving the conversation herself was always better than waiting for him to move it. "We're out of flour. The Henderson supper is Friday, and I promised Margaret a cake." "I'll send Reeves." "I'd rather go myself. The air—" "I said I'll send Reeves." "All right." She put his eggs on the plate and set it in front of him and sat down across the table and drank her coffee and watched him eat. And said nothing about 14 months and 6 entries and a name that had no business being in a county land account. She would have kept saying nothing. She had been saying nothing for 5 years. She was exceptional at it. But the ledger was still on the table. She'd moved it when she stood. She'd thought she'd moved it far enough. But it sat at the edge beside her elbow, with just its corner visible below the cloth she'd laid over it. And Holt set down his fork and looked at it the way a cat looks at something small that's tried to hold still. "You've been in my ledger," he said. "I was checking household accounts. That's what I've always—" "That's my ledger, Clara. I set up those accounts. I know what—" "Stand up." She looked at him across the table. Something in her, some wire-thin, reckless thread, held for 1 second too long before she stood. 1 second where she sat across from him and looked directly back at him instead of dropping her eyes. Because she did know what was in those accounts, and he knew she knew, and they both knew what that meant. And for 1 second, Clara let that knowledge sit between them in the open, like a coin on a table. Then she stood. He came around the table without hurrying. That was the thing about Holt Deering that people never understood from the outside. He was never sloppy, never hot with it. Every movement was considered. Every blow landed exactly where he intended it to land. Her cheek hit the kitchen wall. She grabbed for the counter and got her hands on it and held herself up. Her vision split and came back, and split again. "You don't go through my books," Holt said, somewhere close behind her, his voice as unhurried as a man reading aloud. "You don't ask about my accounts. You don't think about what I do in my capacity as an officer of the law. You are a woman, and my wife, and those things have nothing to do with you. Say you understand." "I understand." "Good." She heard him take his hat from the hook. "Clean yourself up. You look a mess. And I'll have Reeves come by for the flour." The door closed. Clara stood with her palm flat against the wall, breathing through her nose. Then she straightened and walked to the mirror above the dry sink and looked at her face the way a carpenter looks at a crack in a beam, assessing, not grieving. The bruise was rising fast, high on her cheekbone where powder wouldn't cover it and her hair wouldn't reach it. She'd have to wear her bonnet pulled low and look at her feet and let people assume. She'd been letting people assume for 5 years. "Go," said something in the center of her chest. "Today, before he comes home tonight and decides the kitchen wall wasn't enough of a lesson." She'd heard that voice before, 100 times, standing in front of this same mirror, looking at this same face getting smaller in it year by year. And every time the voice faded. Because where she would go was a question with no answer. No money that was hers. No family Holt hadn't quietly, systematically cut away. And the law in Ridgefall wore her husband's face. She tied her bonnet and went into town anyway. Not because she was brave, because the house was pressing in on her, and she needed ground under her feet. And she needed to see other human faces, even if those faces slid past her like water around a stone. Half a mile down the packed dirt road into Ridgefall Prop Street was busy. A lumber delivery had a half-dozen wagons pulled up at the mill, men shouting across the noise and the rising dust. Clara kept to the boardwalk, past the post office, past the barber, past the millinery, where Agnes Holloway stood in the window, saw Clara coming, and found something urgent to attend to on the far side of her shop. Clara had stopped letting herself feel that. Or she'd told herself she had. She was 30 yards from the dry goods when she heard him. She didn't turn right away. She stopped walking and drew one slow breath and made her face into the blank she'd spent 5 years perfecting. Not afraid, not angry, just empty. Just a surface he couldn't get purchase on. And then she turned. Holt was coming from the sheriff's office, walking fast with that rolling stride that made people step aside without knowing why they did it. He'd said he had business at the Kerrigan Ranch all morning. He was not supposed to be here. He'd seen her. "Clara!" His voice carried across the whole street. Heads turned. "I told you Reeves was handling the flour." "I needed some air," she said, keeping her voice level. "It's a short walk." He reached her, and the smile was on his face, the public one, the one that looked like concern. "What did I tell you this morning?" "Holt, please." She caught herself saying it before she could stop, hating the word even as it came out. Please. Like please had ever done a single thing for her. "What did I tell you?" She was aware of all of them. Agnes Holloway's window, empty now, but watched from behind the curtain. She'd have bet money on it. Herb Castleton, in his chair outside the barber, still as a post. 2 men from the Kerrigan outfit against a hitching post, looking at their boots with the focused attention of men seeing something they'd decided not to see. Doris Maynard's face in the dry goods window for 1 second before she pulled back. And across the street, a stranger she'd never seen, tall and lean, dark-haired, just stepping down off his horse in front of Miller's feed, who looked up at exactly that moment and did not look away. "You told me to stay home," Clara said quietly. "I'm sorry. I'll go back." "You'll go back when I'm finished." Holt took her arm above the elbow, finding the exact spot where he always found it, where the nerves ran shallow. Not brutal enough that anyone watching could call it what it was. Just a husband holding his wife's arm. "You want to tell me why you think you can disobey me twice before noon?" "I don't." She kept her voice down, her chin level, not dropping her eyes all the way. She'd given up the full submission gesture 2 years ago. She wasn't sure he'd noticed, but she'd noticed. And it had cost her nothing yet, and she kept it. "I made a mistake coming out. It won't happen again." "It won't," he agreed pleasantly. "But you need to understand something first. About respect. About what it means when my wife walks around this town doing whatever she pleases after I've specifically... I was getting flour." She said it quietly. Just the facts. Nothing edged in it. "That's all I was doing, Holt. There's no story here." His grip tightened. "Don't tell me what the story is." "I'm not. I'm just saying..." She never finished the sentence. His palm came across her jaw, and she went off the boardwalk sideways, both feet gone, and hit the street dirt hard. Knees, then hands, then one hip, and the world went white for a second and came back brown and gritty. Dust in her mouth, dust on her palms, the sky tilting above her. She heard the street go quiet. Not the gradual quiet of people paying attention. The sudden, total quiet of people choosing not to. "Get up," Holt's voice from above her, calm and patient. "You're embarrassing yourself." Clara's hands were flat on the ground. Hot, packed dirt under her fingers. She pressed her palms down and felt the solid earth beneath them. And something moved in her chest. Not courage, not yet, but its rough antecedent. Something wordless and animal, and tired, that said no, and meant it, even if no one heard it but the dirt. She started to rise, not because he told her to, because she chose to. That was the distinction she made in her own mind, in the 2 seconds it took her to get her hands under her. And it was the smallest possible act of defiance, invisible to everyone watching. But it was hers. Holt's boot came down beside her hand, close enough to stop her without touching her, close enough to remind her what would happen if he decided to touch her. She stayed where she was. "I didn't say rise yet," he said pleasantly. He crouched beside her, tilting his head at an angle that would look, from the boardwalk, like a man checking on his fallen wife. His thumb found the bruise from this morning and pressed into it without urgency.
"You think about those accounts again? You think about things that aren't your concern?"
"No," she said. "No what?" "No, I won't." He held her there another moment, his thumb working in a slow, meticulous circle, and then he stood and adjusted his vest and looked down the street with the easy ownership of a man who'd never once doubted his right to own things. Then he walked away, back toward the sheriff's office. Never looked back. Clara stayed where she was. The dirt was hot. The sky was white with high summer heat. Around her, she could feel the town resuming itself. The slow, collective exhale of 30 people who'd been holding their breath and could now go back to pretending. A shadow fell across the ground in front of her. She thought it was someone stepping over her and braced for the indignity of being an obstacle. But the shadow stopped. Boots settled in the dirt beside her, trail-worn, unpolished, the boots of a man who'd been traveling. A voice came down, quiet and without a trace of pity, which was what made it different from every other voice that had ever spoken to her about her own pain. "Ma'am, give me your hand." She looked up. He was crouching in the dirt with her, which meant he'd come off the boardwalk and walked all the way to the middle of the street, which meant everyone on that boardwalk had watched him do it. Dark hair, a few days unshaved, gray eyes that were looking directly at her face. Not at her bruise, not at her dress, not at the door Holt had disappeared through. At her face. Like it was a face worth looking at. "I'm fine," she said. The lie came out mechanical, worn smooth. "You're bleeding." He nodded at her lip. She touched it and her fingers came away red. "That's not fine." "It's nothing." "I heard you say that." He didn't move, didn't press, just stayed crouched in the dirt with her like he had all the time in the world. "Mason Cole. Rode in about an hour ago." Clara looked at his outstretched hand. She did the math she always did. What it would cost, who was watching, what story Holt would construct out of this image when someone told him about it tonight. She calculated the price of this moment with the same precision she'd brought to every ledger entry for 5 years. She took his hand. He got her to her feet without performance. No steadying hand on her waist, no lingering grip. Just up. And then he stepped back and gave her room. And that step back was the thing that cracked something small and careful in her chest. Because in 5 years, no man had stepped back from her. They either grabbed or they ignored. They owned or they looked away. This man just gave her room, like it was the most natural thing. "Is there a doctor?" he said. "It's not bad enough for Doc Hennessy." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "Doc Hennessy writes household accident in his records and goes back to his supper. I've been there before." Something moved behind Mason Cole's gray eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or the particular kind of anger that goes cold instead of hot. "The man who did this," he said carefully, "is the deputy sheriff. He is the law in Ridgefall," Clara said. "Which means this is just Tuesday." Mason Cole was quiet for a moment. "Is there somewhere you can go?" "Not one place in this town he doesn't have access to." She started to adjust her bonnet, found it gone, somewhere in the dirt behind her, and left it. You should move on. You're new here, which means you don't know what you just did by walking out there. People saw you. He'll hear about it before supper. I imagine he will, Mason said, and didn't move. I'm serious. I'll walk you to the dry goods, he said, and then I'll leave you alone. But I'm walking you there. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She'd had people offer help before. The Reverend who'd told her to pray harder. Mary Ellen Braddock, who'd whispered once at the quilting circle and then avoided Clara's eyes for 6 months. Doc Hennessy and his household accidents. All of them generous with their concern, until the cost of it became real. And then the concern had a way of evaporating like morning frost. She didn't know why this felt different. Maybe it was the crouching in the dirt. Maybe it was the step back. Maybe it was just that she was tired enough to let herself believe in something for 5 more minutes. Dry goods is this way, she said, and walked. He fell into step beside her, not close, not touching, just present in a way that felt like a fence post feels in a windstorm. Not dramatic, just there and not moving. Doris Maynard behind the dry goods counter saw Clara come in and saw the man 1 step behind her and went carefully expressionless. Morning, Clara. Morning, Doris. 20 pounds of flour and vanilla extract if you have it. Got it last week. Doris moved to the shelves. Clara heard her measuring and wrapping and kept her eyes straight ahead. Mason had stopped just inside the door. He wasn't pretending to browse. He was watching the street through the front window, and Clara understood with a quiet shock that he was watching for Holt. What brings you to Ridgefall? She asked, keeping her voice down. Survey work, he said. Territorial Land Office, property disputes, deed verification. A pause. Irregularities in land records. Clara's hands went still on the counter. She thought about 6 entries, 14 months, $80 to a name she didn't recognize. She thought about asking him what kind of irregularities. And she thought about what it would mean to ask. And she thought about 5 years of being careful, and what careful had bought her. And for one long moment, she held herself right at the edge of saying nothing. Then she thought about her father's handwriting on the land deed she'd kept hidden under the 2nd-bedroom floor for 3 years. And she thought about the way Holt had said, "You are a woman and my wife," this morning. And something in her just let go. My maiden name was Clara Hale, she said. My father was Thomas Hale. He owned 40 acres east of Ridgefall Creek before he died 4 years ago. Mason Cole went very still. Carter and Associates, Clara said quietly. Silver City. You know that name? He turned from the window and looked at her directly. Something in his face had shifted. The careful neutrality of a stranger replaced by something more focused, more serious. Where did you hear that name? Holt's ledger, this morning. How long ago was that entry dated? 3 weeks, but there are 6 of them going back 14 months. She held his gaze. I built the tracking system for that land account. I know every dollar that should move through it. Carter and Associates is not supposed to be there. Doris set the flour and vanilla on the counter. $2.40, Clara. Clara counted out the coins, Holt's money, every penny accounted for, and collected her packages. Mason held the door. Out on the boardwalk, the sun hit them both hard, and Clara squinted into it and waited. Your father's land, Mason said. The 40 acres east of the creek. Is there a deed? A will? Clara was quiet for 3 seconds, long enough to make the decision all the way down, not just at the surface. There's both, she said, hidden in the house. Mason nodded slowly. He wasn't triumphant about it. He wasn't performing urgency. He just absorbed the information with the quiet focus of someone who'd been looking for a specific piece and had just found it. Don't move them yet. Don't change anything. Don't let him know you've made any connection between those ledger entries and your father's land. He already knows I saw the ledger,
Then he's already deciding what to do about it.
Mason looked at her steadily. Which means we don't have as much time as I'd like. We. The word sat in the air between them, small and enormous at the same time. Why are you doing this? Clara said. Not suspicion, exactly. Just the honest question of a woman who'd learned that kindness without a reason was usually just a different kind of trap. You rode into this town an hour ago. You don't know me. Mason Cole looked out at Main Street for a moment. Something moved across his face, old and not entirely healed. I grew up watching a man decide that the law was whatever he said it was in his own house, he said. My mother never had one person stand up and call it what it was. He looked back at her. I'm just a man who doesn't like watching that happen twice. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she adjusted her packages and said, I should go home. Yes, he said. And if anything changes, if he does anything tonight that makes you think he's looking for those documents, don't go back into that house. Where would I go? Miller's boarding house, 2nd Street. Ask for Virginia Miller. Tell her I sent you. Clara nodded once. She started down the boardwalk and stopped after 3 steps without turning around. Mr. Cole? Ma'am? Those 6 entries, she said. They're not the whole picture. They're the ones I found in 30 minutes before dawn. She paused. I've been running accounts since I was 12 years old. Give me an hour with those books unsupervised, and I'll find you everything you need. She didn't wait for his response. She walked, and she didn't look back, and her hands had stopped shaking somewhere between the dry goods counter and the boardwalk, and hadn't started again. The house was quiet when she got back. Holt wouldn't be home until supper. She put the flour away and set the vanilla on the shelf, and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the table where the ledger had been. He'd taken it. Of course he had. Clara stood at the kitchen table and thought about a man who'd crouched in the dirt beside her, and a name from Silver City, and her father's handwriting on a deed she'd been keeping like a coal in her fist for 3 years, waiting for something warm enough to put it to. 3 things she knew now, as clearly as any column of figures she'd ever balanced. 1. Those entries meant exactly what she thought they meant, and Holt knew she'd seen them. 2. A man named Mason Cole had ridden into Ridgefall this morning, specifically looking for what she had in that 2nd bedroom floor. 3. The next move she made would determine whether she spent the rest of her life in this kitchen, or finally, after 5 years of shrinking and surviving and saying nothing, started living like a woman who knew what her name was worth. She tied her apron and began to make the Henderson cake. She measured the flour with her usual precision. She cracked the eggs clean. She worked through every step of the recipe with the same careful attention she'd given to those ledger columns that morning. And underneath the steady motion of her hands, her mind was very quiet and very clear, and already doing a different kind of math. Not backward, not adding up damage and loss, but forward, calculating what was possible, what was provable. What a woman with 5 years of numbers in her head, and her father's deed under her floorboard, and one stranger who'd refused to look away, might be able to build into something that could not be ignored. The oven took the cake, and Clara Ashworth, who had been Clara Hale before she'd been foolish enough to believe a man's name could protect her, stood in the kitchen that had never been hers and thought, not much longer. She thought, he should have let me keep the ledger. She thought, that was his one mistake. Outside,
Ridgefall went about its business the way rivers go around stones. But for the first time in 5 years, Clara wasn't standing in the middle of the current hoping not to be swept away. She was standing on solid ground. And she was starting to remember she knew how to swim. Holt came home at 6:15 with mud on his boots and a look on his face that Clara had learned to read the way sailors read weather. Not the storm itself yet, but the particular quality of air before it. She had supper on the table, pot roast, potatoes, the bread she'd baked that afternoon alongside the Henderson cake. Everything where he expected it. She changed her dress and pinned her hair, and covered the cheekbone bruise as well as the powder allowed, which wasn't well, but well enough that he'd have to look directly at her to see it clearly, and Holt rarely looked directly at her anymore. Looking required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement implied she was something worth seeing. He sat. He picked up his fork. He ate 4 bites before he said anything. "Heard you had company on Main Street today." Clara kept her eyes on her plate. "It was nothing. A stranger helped me up, that's all." "That's all." He turned the phrase over like he was examining the underside of a rock. "Man rides into my town, involves himself in my personal business, walks my wife to the store, and that's all." "I didn't ask him to. He was just there." "Who is he?" "He said his name was Mason Cole. I'd never seen him before in my life." Holt set his fork down with a care that was louder than any bang. "And what did Mason Cole want to talk about?" "He asked if I needed a doctor." Clara took a slow breath. "I said no. He walked me to Doris Maynard's, and that was the end of it." "That's the whole conversation?" "That's the whole conversation." He looked at her then. The direct look. The one that was also a measurement, checking for the hairline cracks that meant she was hiding something. Clara had spent 5 years learning how to look back at him during these moments. Not defiant, not frightened, not blank either, because blank read as concealment. Just present. Just a woman who'd told the truth and had nothing more to add to it. "He's with the Territorial Land Office," Holt said. Clara let a small furrow appear between her brows. Careful confusion. Not too much. "I didn't know that." "Survey work," he says. Holt picked up his fork again. "Seems like an interesting coincidence. Stranger rides in from the land office the same morning my wife decides to go wandering around town against my specific instructions." "It was just flour, Holt." "It's never just flour with you, Clara." He said it without heat, which was worse. "You think too much and you talk too much. And today you were in a place you weren't supposed to be, talking to a man you weren't supposed to be talking to. And I want you to understand something." He leaned forward slightly. "I am a patient man. I have been very patient with you. But my patience is a resource, and you keep spending it." Clara said nothing. She had learned that this particular speech required no response. Any response would be treated as an invitation to escalate, and silence could sometimes be mistaken for agreement, which was survivable. She ate 3 bites of potato and waited for him to move the conversation somewhere else. He didn't. "I want you to stay away from Mason Cole." "Of course." "I'm not asking. I understand." He studied her for another moment, then went back to his pot roast, and the rest of supper passed in the particular silence of a household where words had become too expensive to spend carelessly. Clara cleared the plates. She washed the dishes. She heard Holt move to his study, heard the desk drawer open and close, heard the sound of papers being handled. She stood at the dry sink, with her hands in the cooling wash water, and listened to those paper sounds, and thought about 6 ledger entries, and a man who'd said, "We don't have as much time as I'd like." She was right about one thing. He was already moving. She dried her hands and went upstairs, and did not go into the second bedroom. Not tonight. Tonight he was alert, and she was watched. And the floor of that room was the one thing she had left, and she would not risk it for the relief of holding her father's papers in her hands. She went to their bedroom and undressed in the dark, and lay down and listened to the house settle around her, and thought about swimming. She told herself that, standing in the kitchen, she thought she remembered how to swim. Now, in the dark with Holt's footsteps on the stairs, she was less certain. But she didn't take it back. She kept it like she kept everything that mattered, quietly, in a place he couldn't reach. Holt came to bed without speaking. He fell asleep in under 10 minutes, the way men with clear consciences do, or men who'd learned to mistake the absence of doubt for the absence of guilt. Clara lay beside him in the dark and stared at the ceiling, and did not sleep for a very long time. The next morning she found the note. It was tucked under the edge of the flour bin, folded small, written in a hand she didn't know, compact and precise, the handwriting of someone accustomed to measuring things exactly. She unfolded it at the kitchen table while the coffee boiled and Holt's boots were still quiet upstairs. Virginia Miller, 14 2nd Street. Before noon, if you can. Come to the side door. Tell no one. She read it twice. Then she put it in the stove and watched it take the flame, and stood there until nothing remained but a curl of black ash. And she thought about how the note had gotten there. Through a locked back door, into a kitchen, under a flour bin. And she thought about a man who surveyed land for the territorial office, and had gray eyes, and said, "we." And she thought about whether trust was a thing she still remembered how to do, or whether Holt had taken that from her, the same way he'd taken everything else. She made his breakfast. She said good morning when he came down. She listened to him tell her he'd be out past the Kerrigan property until late, that she shouldn't expect him before 8. And she said all right, and poured his coffee, and stood at the stove, and felt the morning shape around her, like a thing she could finally almost hold. He left at 7:40. Clara waited 20 minutes, which was the time it took to be certain he wasn't coming back for a forgotten hat or a recalculated suspicion. And then she untied her apron and put on her gray shawl. Not the good one, not the one he'd given her, the plain one from before, from her own life, and went out the side door. 2nd Street was quieter than Main. It ran parallel but felt like a different world. No storefronts, just houses and the occasional workshop, the steady sound of someone's chickens from somewhere behind a fence. Number 14 was a white frame house, modest and well-kept, with a kitchen garden along the south wall and lace curtains in the ground floor windows. Clara went around to the side door, the way the note had said, and knocked twice. The woman who opened it was older than Clara had expected, 60 maybe, with iron-gray hair and hands that looked like they'd worked every day of those 60 years and weren't finished yet. She had sharp, dark eyes that assessed Clara from boots to bonnet in about 2 seconds, and apparently came to a conclusion, because she stepped back and held the door wider without saying anything. "Virginia Miller?" Clara said. "That's me. Come in before someone sees you standing on my step." The kitchen was warm and smelled like wood smoke, and dried herbs hung in bunches from the ceiling beams. Lavender, sage, something Clara didn't recognize. Virginia Miller moved to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, and set them on the table with the efficiency of a woman who'd fed people her whole life and had no patience for ceremony. "Sit," she said. Clara sat. How did the note get into my kitchen? My grandson does odd jobs for half the households on your side of town. Holt Deering tips badly and doesn't pay attention to who carries his firewood. Virginia sat across from her and wrapped both hands around her cup. "Mason told me you might come." "Mason talks too much about other people's business."
Mason Cole has been in this territory for 6 weeks, documenting a land fraud that goes from here to the territorial capital and back again, Virginia said. He talks exactly as much as the work requires, not more, not less. She studied Clara across the table. He said you built the accounting system for the county land office. I did. And you found entries that shouldn't be there. 6 of them, 14 months. Virginia nodded slowly. Carter and Associates, she said, is not a law firm. It's a name on a piece of paper, incorporated in Silver City 18 months ago by a man named Dale Purcell, who is Holt Deering's cousin on his mother's side. She let that land. The money that moves through that account is the money paid to the people who sign land transfer documents without reading them carefully, or who lose paperwork that ought to be on file, or who look the other way when survey markers get moved in the night. Clara sat with us for a moment. My father's land. Your father's 40 acres east of the creek are currently on record as belonging to the Ridgefall Development Trust, which does not exist as anything more than another piece of paper. The trust was established 14 months ago. Virginia paused. Same time as your first ledger entry. The numbers lined up in Clara's head with the clean, merciless precision of a column that balanced. She felt it the way she always felt true math. Not like a surprise, but like a confirmation of something she'd already known in her bones. He transferred my father's land to a fake trust, she said, while my father was still alive. Your father died 4 years ago. The transfer documents are dated 11 months before his death. Clara set down her coffee cup very carefully. Those documents are forged. Mason believes so, but believing and proving are different things. And right now, Holt Deering controls every official record in this county. Virginia leaned forward. That's why we need what you have in your house, Clara. Your father's original deed. His will, if there is one. Any correspondence about the land, letters, receipts, anything in his handwriting that establishes his ownership after the date on those transfer documents. There's a deed and a will both, Clara said. My father's signature, properly witnessed. I've had them for 3 years.
Why didn't you...
Virginia stopped herself, looked at Clara's face, looked at the bruise that the morning light made difficult to overlook. Never mind, she said quietly. I know why. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. A log shifted in the stove. How many people know about this? Clara asked. Mason, myself, a federal land inspector named George Whitmore, who's been corresponding with Mason for 2 months and is currently riding toward Ridgefall from Santa Fe. Virginia paused. He'll be here in 4 days. That's our window. Once a federal inspector's involved, Holt can't make this disappear through local channels. But we need the documents before Whitmore arrives, and we need them before Holt decides to go looking for them himself. He already suspects I saw something in the ledger. I know. Mason told me about yesterday. Virginia looked at her steadily. How bad was it? I've had worse. That's not the answer I asked for. Clara met her eyes. It was enough that I know he's recalculating. The violence isn't random with Holt. It's a management tool. When he thinks I'm getting ideas, he uses it to reset my thinking. She heard herself saying it aloud, the plainest description she'd ever given of 5 years, to someone she'd met 12 minutes ago. And something about the plainness of it, the clinical accuracy, made it somehow easier to say than all the softened versions she'd carried alone. He'll give me a day or 2 of relative calm to convince himself I've been reset. Then, if he's not satisfied, he'll escalate. Then we have a day or 2, Virginia said. She stood and moved to the window, looked out at the garden for a moment, with her hands clasped behind her back. There's a circuit court judge coming through in 3 weeks.
His name is Arthur Beaumont, and he is not Holt Deering's man. He's the only judge within 400 miles who isn't. She turned back to Clara.
If we can get your documents to George Whitmore and build the case before Beaumont arrives, we have a real chance. Not just at the land fraud, at all of it. Clara understood what all of it meant. She'd understood it since she'd watched Holt walk away from her on Main Street yesterday, and felt the whole town rearrange itself around his absence, like iron filings around a magnet. "And Mason?" she said. "What does he get from this?" Virginia's expression shifted slightly, something between amusement and respect. "You're asking that?" "I ask about motivation because I've stopped assuming good faith without evidence. Call it a lesson learned." "Fair enough." Virginia sat back down. "Mason Cole spent 4 years as an investigative agent for the Territorial Court before he took the land office position. He's worked 3 cases like this one, all of them involving local officials using badge authority to steal land from widows and settlers who didn't have the legal knowledge to fight back." She paused. "His mother lost her home when he was 16 to a man exactly like your husband. Different county, same method. Mason's been looking for cases he can actually win ever since." Clara sat with that for a moment. She thought about gray eyes that went hard and cold instead of hot. She thought about, "I grew up watching a man decide that the law was whatever he said it was in his own house." She thought about the way he'd stepped back after helping her up, and she thought that maybe that step back had its own history behind it, its own lesson learned in a different kitchen, in a different county, with a different woman who hadn't had anyone to crouch in the dirt beside her. "I can get the documents tomorrow," she said. "Holt has a county commissioners meeting in the morning. He'll be gone 3 hours at minimum. 3 hours is enough." Virginia stood and refilled both their cups without asking. "Bring them here. Don't carry them out in your hands. Put them in a market basket under something ordinary." "I know how to carry things past a man who checks everything," Clara said. Virginia looked at her, and the look held something that wasn't pity and wasn't admiration, and was somewhere between them. The recognition that passes between people who've survived the same particular kind of education. "Yes," she said. "I imagine you do." Clara drank her coffee. The kitchen was warm, and the herbs smelled green and living, and the woman across from her had iron in her spine and enough sense not to apologize for any of it. And Clara sat inside all of that for a moment and let herself feel what it was. She hadn't been in a room with another woman who looked at her without performing ignorance in longer than she could accurately date. She'd forgotten the specific texture of being seen by someone who was paying full attention. "There's one more thing," Virginia said, setting her cup down. "Mason needs to speak with you directly. He has questions about the accounting system, about how the transfers were structured, whether there are other accounts you built that might have similar entries. Things he needs to understand from someone who designed the system." She paused. "He'll come here tomorrow afternoon, after you've brought the documents, if that's all right with you." Clara thought about what Holt would say. She thought about the price of it, calculated the risk with the same reflex that ran every column of figures she'd ever touched. Then she thought about a federal land inspector 4 days out, and a circuit judge 3 weeks away, and a dead man's deed under a floorboard that had been waiting 3 years for exactly this kind of fire to be useful. "Tell him to be here at 2, she said. Virginia nodded. "I'll tell him." She stood and walked Clara back to the side door with the same brisk efficiency she'd used to open it. "Be careful going home, and Clara—" She stopped with her hand on the doorframe. "Whatever Holt says tonight, whatever he does, don't react. Don't change anything. Don't let him see you thinking forward." "I've had 5 years of practice not letting him see me think," Clara said. She stepped out into the thin morning light and walked back the way she'd come, her gray shawl pulled close,
her market basket empty on her arm, her face doing the thing it did in public. Composed, quiet, the careful nothing that kept her safe. But underneath it, in the part of her that Holt Deering had never once reached, something was moving. Not hope yet. She was too careful for hope. She knew what hope cost, and she wasn't ready to pay it until she had something more than a plan and a 4-day window, and a man with gray eyes who'd crouched in the dirt beside her.
But it was close to hope. Close enough that she kept her eyes forward on the road and did not let herself examine it too directly, the way you don't look straight at the sun if you've been a long time in the dark. She turned onto her street, and the Deering house rose up ahead of her, white-painted and silent in the morning light. And Clara Ashworth looked at it the way she hadn't let herself look at it in 5 years. Not as a home, not as a prison, but as a temporary condition. A problem with a solution. A column that was about to balance. The commissioners' meeting started at 9. Clara knew this because she had attended every public function in Ridgefall for 5 years as Holt's wife, standing at his left shoulder, wearing the right dress and the right expression while he worked the room. And she had paid attention to all of it, the schedules, the routines, the patterns of a man who ran his life like clockwork, because clockwork could not surprise him. He left the house at 8:45. She watched him ride down the road from the kitchen window, and then she waited 15 minutes and went upstairs. The second bedroom had been a sewing room once, before Holt had decided sewing rooms were an indulgence and moved her things to a corner of the main bedroom. Now it held a spare cot, a trunk of lemons she never used, and under a braided rug in the northeast corner, a floorboard that sat a 1/4 inch higher than its neighbors. She'd noticed the gap the first week they'd lived here. She'd never told Holt about it because even then, 3 weeks into the marriage, something in her was already making contingency plans she didn't yet have language for. She moved the rug, worked her thumbnail into the gap, lifted the board. The papers were exactly where she'd put them 3 years ago, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, tied with the same piece of twine her father had used on everything he considered important. She unwrapped them with hands that were steady and her heart beating fast, and read through them once to confirm. The deed in her father's careful handwriting. The will, witnessed by 2 men whose names she still knew. A letter from the county land office in Missouri, dated 6 months before his death, acknowledging Thomas Hale's ownership of 40 acres. And a receipt of tax payment for that same land dated 3 years prior to the forged transfer date on Holt's documents. That last one she hadn't thought about in years. A tax receipt. Such an ordinary piece of paper. Such an unambiguous piece of paper. You don't pay taxes on land you don't own, and you can't forge a payment record that the county tax office in Missouri also has a copy of. Clara sat back on her heels and felt something she recognized from her father's accounting office. The particular satisfaction of a column that doesn't just balance, but prove something. She rewrapped the papers in the oilcloth, replaced the twine, and put the board back. She smoothed the rug over it. She went downstairs and put the packet at the bottom of her market basket, under 2 folded dish towels and a jar of the Henderson cake preserves she'd been meaning to return. Then she put her gray shawl on and walked to 2nd Street. Virginia took the basket at the side door without a word, set it on the kitchen table, unwrapped the oilcloth with careful hands, and went through each document the same way Clara had, methodically, reading every line. When she got to the tax receipt, she stopped. "Does Mason know about this?" Clara asked. "He doesn't know it exists." Virginia set it aside from the others. "He's going to want to talk to you before Whitmore arrives. This changes the shape of the case." She looked up. "This means the forgery has a hard date. It can't have occurred before Holt's family had access to the county record system, which means it can't have occurred before Holt was appointed deputy." That's a narrow window, and there are people who were present for every day of it.
The previous deputy, Clara said. Old Cal Briggs. He retired 2 weeks after Holt's appointment. He was in that office every day for the handover.
Virginia was already making a note. Is Briggs still in town?
He moved to his daughter's place outside Albuquerque. But he's alive, and I have no reason to think he's Holt's man. Holt never respected him much.
Clara paused.
Which might mean Briggs saw something he wasn't supposed to see, and that's why Holt pushed for his retirement.
Virginia looked at her with the expression she'd been giving Clara since yesterday. Not surprise exactly, but the steady recalibration of someone updating their assessment. You've been thinking about this longer than 2 days, she said. I've been thinking about this since my father died, and the land transferred without my knowledge. And Holt told me not to worry about it, because he'd handled everything. Clara folded her hands on the table. I just didn't have anywhere to take it. Mason arrived at 2, on the exact minute, came through the side door, sat down across from Clara at Virginia's kitchen table, and put a leather survey satchel on the table between them. He had the look of a man who'd been working since before sunrise, and intended to keep working until after dark, which was a look Clara recognized and respected. The tax receipt, he said, after Virginia had shown him. He turned it over in his hands, twice. Do you know if your father kept copies of correspondence with the county office? He kept everything, Clara said. He had a fire safe in his study in Missouri. When he died, I had 2 days in the house before his lawyer shipped everything to Holt, who had just become my husband and had power of attorney over my inheritance. I took what I could carry in my hands. She nodded at the oilcloth packet. That was it. Mason set the receipt down. The lawyer, do you have a name? Edmund Farwell, Jefferson City, Missouri. He would have records of the estate filing. Mason wrote it down. And the witnesses on the will. Marcus Webb and, He turned the document to read it. A Dolores Wren. Marcus Webb was my father's business partner. I don't know where he is now. Dolores Wren was his housekeeper for 20 years. She retired to her sister's home in Kansas City. Clara looked at him steadily. I know what you're going to ask. Yes, she'd remember witnessing that will. She was there when my father dictated it. She cried the whole time. Something shifted in Mason's face. Not the cold, focused look he'd been wearing since he sat down, but something briefly warmer that came and went like a lamp in a passing window. You've kept track of all of them. I'm an accountant, Mr. Cole. I keep track of things. Mason. I keep track of things, Mason. It's the only kind of power that doesn't require anyone's permission. He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that had a way of landing directly and staying. Then he opened his satchel and spread 3 survey maps on the table, waited at the corners with a coffee cup and 2 books Virginia supplied without being asked. I need you to look at something, he said. Tell me if this matches what you know. The map showed the land around Ridgefall Creek in sections, each parcel marked with its recorded ownership. Clara leaned forward and read them the way she read ledger pages. Not the shape of the thing, but the content, the specific numbers and names, and the relationships between them. Her finger moved across the paper without touching it, tracing the boundary of a parcel marked Ridgefall Development Trust. That's wrong, she said. Which part? The boundary. My father's eastern line ran to the creek bend, not to the survey marker. These maps move the marker 40 feet west, which takes his access to the water and adds it to the Kerrigan property. She sat back. The Kerrigan Ranch. Holt does legal work for the Kerrigans. He does, Mason said. So the Kerrigans get water rights they didn't have before, and the land my father owned, the land that now belongs to a fake trust, sits dry on the wrong side of a moved boundary marker. Clara looked at him. How much is water access worth out here? The Kerrigan operation is running 4,000 head north. He paused. With the creek access, they're looking at doubling their herd value over the next 5 years. And what did the Kerrigans pay for that? That's what I've been trying to prove. Mason pulled another document from the satchel, a handwritten ledger page, a copy, not an original, with figures Clara recognized immediately. This is a reproduction of the county land account entries from 18 months ago. Do these match what you saw in Holt's ledger? Clara studied the figures. Her mind ran through them the way it always ran through numbers, automatically, the same reflex that had been keeping her alive in this marriage, by finding the small discrepancies before Holt could use them against her. The amounts match, she said slowly. But the notation system is different. In Holt's ledger, the entries are coded under household maintenance. These are coded under legal services, she pointed. Whoever made these entries is the same person. Same handwriting characteristics, same decimal placement habit. But they were entered into 2 different books with 2 different explanations. Mason was very still. You can see that from the notation system? I built the notation system. She looked up at him. I created those codes. Holt told me it was for efficiency. He said it was the same system the county office used across all territories. And I believed him, because I'd never seen the county system for myself. But I designed every code in that book, Mason. Household maintenance is code HM-. Legal services is code LS-. These entries are showing up as LS in the county copy and HM in Holt's household ledger. She felt the cold clarity of it moving through her like creek water. He's been laundering payments from the Kerrigans through the household accounts, running them as domestic expenses so they disappear into normal household activity. To anyone checking the county ledger, it looks like legal fees. To anyone checking the household accounts, it looks like we spent a lot of money on maintenance. And to anyone checking both, Mason said quietly, you'd only check both if you built the system and knew every code. Clara sat back. He thought that was safe. He thought the person who could read both sets of books at once was someone he controlled completely. The kitchen was quiet. Virginia, who had been sitting at the far end of the table saying nothing, set down her coffee cup. There are more of them, aren't there? Clara said. Not just the Kerrigans. Mason pulled 2 more pages from the satchel. The Aldridge farm on the North Fork. The Peterson grazing rights, a water easement that belonged to a widow named Sarah Coombs, who sold her property and moved to Denver 18 months ago, 3 weeks after the easement was transferred out of her name. He spread the pages on the table beside the maps. All of them run through the same account structure. All of them within 18 months of Holt's appointment. Clara looked at the pages and felt the shape of it the way you feel the shape of a room in the dark. The walls, the dimensions, the particular architecture of a thing built deliberately in a space where no one was supposed to look. This isn't opportunism, she said. He didn't stumble into this and get greedy. He planned it before he took the appointment. The accounting system, the code structure, the dual entry method. He had all of that in place before he was ever sworn in. She looked up. He married me for this. He knew what my father's land was worth, and he knew I was the only person who could build a system that would hide it. And he spent the first year of our marriage getting me to do exactly that. She said it the way she'd said everything in this kitchen. Plainly, like a number. She didn't let herself feel it yet. There would be time for that later, in the dark, when she could afford to. Right now, it was just data. Mason was watching her face carefully. Clara. Don't. She shook her head once. Don't do the thing where you tell me it's not my fault. I know it's not my fault. I was 26 years old, and I'd just lost my father,
and I thought I was choosing safety." She pressed her palms flat on the table. "What I need to know right now is whether what I've just told you is enough. Whether George Whitmore can use this." Mason and Virginia exchanged a look that lasted about 1 second. "It's more than enough to open a federal investigation," Mason said. "The dual entry system alone proves intent. The tax receipt proves the forgery date. The witness list on your father's will gives us corroborating sources in 2 other states." He paused. "But there's a problem." "He's going to come for the documents." "He's going to come for everything," Mason said. "Last night, he sent a rider to Silver City. I don't know who he contacted, but the rider came back this morning. Whatever he's setting in motion, he's moving faster than I expected." He leaned forward. "Is there anything in that house, anything at all, that he could use to discredit you before we get to Whitmore? Any letter, any document you've signed, anything he could reframe?" Clara thought carefully. She ran through the house in her mind, the way she'd run through those ledger pages. Methodically, nothing skipped. "The household accounts I kept for the first 3 years," she said slowly. "They're in his study. They're in my handwriting." He could argue I was a knowing participant in the scheme. Can he make that argument hold? Not if I testify to how I was instructed to structure the entries. Not if the court understands that I designed a household accounting system and was told by my husband what categories to use. She paused. "But if something happens to me before I testify—" "Nothing is going to happen to you," Mason said. The certainty in his voice stopped her. Not the loudness of it, he hadn't raised it, but the quality, the complete absence of qualification. Clara looked at him, and he looked back at her, and she thought about a man who'd crouched in the dirt of Main Street and held out his hand, and then stepped back, and she thought about his mother in a different county with the same kind of husband, and she thought that sometimes people carried their history in the way they said things. "You can't promise that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I can tell you that Virginia's house has 2 women in it tonight, and I'll be within shouting distance. And George Whitmore is 3 days out and riding hard. And whatever Holt is planning, he's planning it around the assumption that you're still alone." He held her gaze. "You're not alone, Clara." The word landed the way it always landed when someone said it to her now, with the small shock of something she hadn't realized she was still hoping for. She looked at the documents spread on Virginia's kitchen table, her father's handwriting and her own, and 5 years of numbers that told a story Holt Deering had been counting on staying buried. And she thought that her father had known. He'd known that a woman's knowledge was the one thing that couldn't be forged or transferred or buried under a fake trust's name. He'd given her the accounting because he'd understood, in the way that careful fathers sometimes understand about the world their daughters are walking into, that it would be the last thing standing when everything else was gone. "I need to go home," she said. "If I'm not there when he gets back from the meeting, he'll know something's changed." She began gathering her shawl. "The household account ledger's in his study. There's a blue cloth cover on the earliest one, 1878. That's the one that will show the initial entry structure, where I set up the HM codes. If you can get to it before he destroys it—" "I know a man," Virginia said. "He's done work in that office. He can get in after hours." "The spare key is under the 3rd pot on the left side of the front porch," Clara said. "I put it there 2 years ago, in case I ever locked myself out. Holt doesn't know it exists." Mason looked at her. "How long have you been planning this?" Clara considered the question honestly. She thought about the note tucked under the flower bin, how she'd burned it without hesitation and felt no grief. She thought about the floorboard and the oilcloth, and 3 years of waiting without a name for what she was waiting for.
She thought about the morning she'd made herself memorize every code in Holt's ledger system, telling herself it was just habit, just the reflex of a woman trained to know numbers, when the truth was, she'd known even then that someday she was going to need to be able to explain exactly what those entries meant and why. "Since about 3 weeks after my wedding," she said, "when I realized what kind of man I'd married, and understood that no one was going to save me, so I'd better start saving myself." She picked up her empty basket and walked to the side door. Mason was on his feet, not blocking the way, just standing up the way he did things. Present, available, not in the way. "Tomorrow," he said, "whatever happens tonight, whatever he says or does, come here tomorrow morning. Even if you think everything is fine, come here." Clara put her hand on the doorframe and looked back at him. The afternoon light was coming through Virginia's kitchen window at a low angle, catching the dust motes and the dried lavender and the edges of her father's papers still spread on the table. And for a moment, the whole scene held the quality of something she would remember later. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was the last moment before everything stopped being containable. "I'll come," she said. She went home. The house was still empty, the way it would be for another 40 minutes at minimum. But something felt different when she stepped through the back door. Not a sound, not a visible change, just the air of the house, the particular quality of its silence, which she had learned over 5 years the way a musician learns a chord. Every note of it, every subtle variation that meant he'd been here, or hadn't, that meant something had been moved or opened or read. She stood in the kitchen doorway and held very still. Her eyes went to the shelf above the dry sink where she kept the vanilla extract and the baking powder and the small green crock that held her grocery money. Holt's money. $7.40 she'd counted that morning. She looked at the crock and looked away, and looked back. It was 3 inches from where it had been this morning. 3 inches to the right, facing the wall instead of the door. Clara set her market basket down on the kitchen table without hurrying, and walked to the crock and looked inside. $7.40, exactly as she'd left it. Not the money. He hadn't been looking for money. He'd picked it up and set it back down and not quite remembered where it had been. He'd been in the kitchen today, during the commissioners' meeting, while she was at Virginia Miller's house on 2nd Street. Holt Deering had been in his own kitchen looking for something. She didn't know what. She didn't know if he'd found it. She stood at the dry sink and ran the math on it the way she ran everything. Quickly, precisely, accounting for every variable, and came to the only conclusion the numbers supported. He was already looking. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for yet, which meant he hadn't found it. But he was looking, and the looking had started today, which meant they had less time than Virginia had said, and possibly less time than Mason had planned for. Clara looked at the back door. She looked at the stairs. She looked at the kitchen she'd cooked 10,000 meals in, the table she'd sat across from her husband at for 5 years, saying nothing. The wall she'd hit 2 mornings ago for the crime of knowing what was in a ledger she'd built with her own hands. She walked to the stove and began making supper, and her hands were steady, and in the front room the grandfather clock ticked towards 6 o'clock. And somewhere on the road from the county commissioner's building, Holt Deering was riding home to a wife who had spent the afternoon dismantling everything he thought he'd built. And he didn't know it yet. And the not knowing yet was the only margin Clara Ashworth had left. She intended to make it count. Holt came home at 6:10, and she knew within 30 seconds of him walking through the door that something had shifted. It wasn't anything he said. It was the way he moved through the kitchen. Not the rolling, deliberate stride of a man who owned the room, but something tighter, more contained. The movement of a man who was holding himself very carefully together,
because something inside had become unstable. He set his hat on the hook. He sat at the table. He looked at the supper she'd laid out and did not reach for his fork. "Sit down, Clara." She sat. She put her hands in her lap where he couldn't see them, and made her face into the nothing she needed it to be. "I had an interesting conversation today," Holt said. "After the meeting. With Dale. Dale Purcell, his cousin. Carter and Associates, Silver City." Clara felt the information land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, and kept her face exactly where it was. "He rode up from Silver City this morning," Holt continued. "Apparently, someone has been making inquiries about land records in this county. Official inquiries. The Territorial Land Office." He looked at her across the table with the flat, patient attention of a man who has already decided what he knows and is simply watching to see how long the other person takes to confirm it. "You know anything about that?" "How would I know anything about land office business?" "You talked to the surveyor." "I told you what we talked about." "You told me he walked you to the dry goods." Holt's voice was still and careful, the voice she feared more than the loud one. "You didn't tell me he works fraud cases for the Territorial Court. You didn't tell me his last 2 cases both involved deputy officials in land records disputes." He paused. Dale did some checking. Clara looked at her plate. "I didn't know any of that. He said he was a surveyor." "Clara." He said her name the way he said everything when he was past the warning stage. Without inflection, without warmth. Just a sound that meant, "Stop performing. I know what you are. I want you to listen to me very carefully. Whatever you think you know, whatever this man has told you, whatever ideas you have been entertaining in that head of yours, it ends tonight. Do you hear me?" "I haven't done anything, Holt." "You went to Virginia Miller's house yesterday morning." The floor of the conversation dropped out from under her. She didn't let it show. She kept her hands still in her lap, and her eyes on the table, and breathed through the cold wave of it. Not panic. She would not allow panic. Panic was information she couldn't afford to give him. And said, "I went to buy eggs. She keeps chickens." Virginia Miller has been buying her eggs from the feed store for 3 years. Everybody in this town knows that, except apparently my wife. He stood up from the table, and the sound of his chair scraping was different tonight. Abrupt. Not the slow, deliberate scrape of a man in control, but the sharp scrape of a man who is running out of patience with his own performance. "Who else have you talked to?" "The Miller woman." "Who else has she introduced you to?" "No one." "You're lying." "I'm not." She looked up at him then, because dropping her eyes now would be an admission. "Holt, I went to buy eggs, and she didn't have any, and I came home. That's what happened." He crossed to her side of the table in 3 steps, and she was on her feet before his hand reached her. Not fast enough. His fist closed in the collar of her dress, and he pulled her up and forward, and she grabbed the table edge and held on. "I have built something in this county," he said, his face 6 inches from hers, his voice low and shaking with the effort of keeping it quiet. "I have spent 4 years building something that works, that pays, that is going to make this family prosperous for the next 20 years. And I will not have it destroyed by a woman who can't learn to stay in her own lane." "Let go of me." "Where are they?" "Where are what?" He shook her, once, hard, her teeth clicking together. "Your father's papers, the deed. I know you have them. I've known for 2 years you took something from that house before the lawyer sealed it. Where are they?" Clara looked at him. She thought about the oilcloth packet sitting on Virginia Miller's kitchen table on 2nd Street. She thought about her father's handwriting and the tax receipt and the date that couldn't be forged. She thought about Mason Cole saying, "You're not alone," and George Whitmore 3 days out, and a circuit judge 3 weeks away. And she thought about 5 years of this kitchen and this table and this man's hand in her collar. And she made a decision that she understood, even as she made it, was irreversible. "I burned them," she said, 2 years ago, when I realized they were never going to do me any good. Holt went very still. "I kept them for a year after Papa died, thinking I'd do something with them," she continued, her voice flat and even, and believable, because she had spent 5 years making unbelievable things sound flat and even. And it turned out the skill worked in both directions. "And then I understood what you'd explained to me, that the transfer was legal, that when we married, everything became joint property, that there was nothing to do. So I burned them." She held his gaze. "They're gone." The stillness stretched for 10 seconds. She counted them. Then he released her collar, slowly, and stepped back. And the look on his face was something she'd never quite seen before. Not satisfied, not relieved, but recalibrating. The look of a man who'd prepared for one problem, and now had to decide whether the problem was actually solved, or whether he was being managed. "If you're lying to me," he said. "I'm not. If you're lying to me, Clara, what happens next will be worse than anything before." He said it with no particular emphasis, the way you state a fact about weather or distance. "I want you to understand that." "I understand." He picked up his hat from where he'd dropped it on the table and walked to the door. "I'm going out. Don't wait up." The door closed. She stood in the kitchen and listened to his horse leave the yard, and kept standing until the hoofbeats faded and the night settled around the house in its ordinary way. Crickets, and the distant sound of the mill shutting down for the evening, and the grandfather clock in the front room beginning its slow count towards 7. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor, because her legs had decided that was enough. Just sat down right there on the boards, with her back against the cabinet and her hands in her lap, and breathed. She breathed for 2 full minutes, counting, the way her father had taught her to count when the numbers got too big to hold at once. "Break them down," he'd said, "one column at a time, one column at a time." She got up. She went to the front room and looked out the window, and the street was empty, and the Deering house sat in its usual position of solid respectability at the edge of Ridgefall's better neighborhood, white-painted and quiet. And Clara looked at it from the inside for the last time and thought, clearly and without drama, "I am not sleeping in this house tonight." She went upstairs. She did not take much. She took the things she'd been cataloging in her mind for 2 years, the things that were hers, not the things that were decorated with his money or chosen by his taste or given as management rather than affection. Her mother's brooch from the jewelry box, the photograph of her father from her bedside table, the one where he was standing in front of his office in Missouri, squinting into the sun, looking like a man who still had time. The gray shawl from the hook, the $32 she'd saved over 4 years in a flat tobacco tin behind the winter quilts, her own money, earned from the Hendersons and 2 other families who paid her a small fee to manage their household accounts. Money she'd told Holt was quilting income because he found quilting too tedious to question. She put it all in the market basket under the dish towels that were still there from this morning. She looked around the room once, just once, and walked out. The walk to 2nd Street took 8 minutes. She'd timed it once, 2 years ago, standing in the kitchen imagining an emergency route, filing the information away in the same place she filed everything that might someday be useful. 8 minutes on a quiet night with no one on the road, which was what she had. Virginia answered the side door before she finished knocking. She looked at Clara's face, looked at the market basket, and stepped back without saying anything. Clara walked in and set the basket on the table and sat down, and Virginia put the kettle on. "He knows about the land office," Clara said. "His cousin came from Silver City. He's been running his own inquiry into Mason's background. How much does he know? Enough to be afraid, not enough to have stopped us yet. She paused. He asked about the documents. I told him I burned them 2 years ago. Virginia turned from the stove. Did he believe you? I don't know. He believed it enough to leave the house, which is what mattered. Clara looked at her hands. He'll think about it overnight and decide whether it's true. By morning, he'll either have accepted it and moved on to other problems, or he'll have decided I'm lying and come looking. Then we move up the timeline. Virginia crossed to the door that led to the rest of the house and called up the stairs. Mason! He came down in under a minute, which meant he'd been awake, which meant Virginia had told him to stay close. He read the situation off Clara's face the same way Virginia had, quickly, accurately, without requiring explanation, and sat down across from her. He went out, Clara said. I don't know where. If it's Dale Purcell, he's riding to the edge of town and back. If it's someone else... She stopped. Who else would it be? Mason said. Judge Collier. She watched Mason's expression change. He's Holt's man. He handles anything Holt needs handled in the local court. If Holt is deciding to move fast, he'd want Collier on notice. She looked at him steadily. And moving fast with Collier means getting an injunction, freezing any claims against county property pending investigation. It wouldn't stop a federal inspector, but it would muddy the water enough to make Whitmore's job harder. He can't get an injunction without a filing, Mason said. And a filing requires naming the claim. He'd have to acknowledge that there's something to dispute. Collier would file it as a nuisance action, a complaint against fraudulent survey claims. He'd name you. She held Mason's gaze. He'd argue you've been misrepresenting your authority, running a personal vendetta against a county official, harassing a local businessman on behalf of outside interests. And he'd attach my name to it as a co-conspirator. She paused. It wouldn't hold up to federal scrutiny, but it wouldn't need to. It just needs to cloud the record long enough for him to find those documents and destroy them. Mason was quiet for a moment. The kettle began its low whistle, and Virginia lifted it off the heat and poured without interrupting. The documents are safe, Mason said. I sent copies to Whitmore by rider this morning. He has them. Clara stared at him. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to change anything about how you behaved today. If you knew the copies were already gone, you might have relaxed, just slightly, and he would have seen it. He held her eyes. I'm sorry for not telling you. It was a calculated decision, and I'd make it again. But I'm sorry. Clara sat with that for a moment. She thought about the 8 minutes of walking here in the dark, about the $32 in the tobacco tin, and her father's photograph, and the gray shawl, about the kitchen floor, and the counting. She thought about a calculated decision made on her behalf without her knowledge, and she felt the automatic flinch of a woman who'd had too many decisions made for her. And she felt the counterweight of understanding why he'd done it. And she sat between those two things for a moment, and chose to be honest about both of them. Don't do that again, she said. I won't. I mean it. Whatever decisions get made from here forward, I'm part of making them. Not after the fact. Not managed. She looked at him directly. I've been managed for 5 years. I know what it feels like. And I know the difference between management and protection. And I need you to know that I know. Understood, Mason said, without deflection and without apology beyond the one he'd already given. Completely understood. Something settled between them then. Not the warm thing, not yet, but its necessary antecedent, the thing that had to come first, which was mutual ground. Two people at the same table, with the same information, making the same decisions at the same time. Clara had not had that with anyone in 5 years, and she felt the steadiness of it, like the steadiness of good math. Whitmore, she said. You said 3 days. I sent him a wire this morning, asking him to push. It's hard, 2 days. Then we have tonight and tomorrow. She wrapped her hands around the teacup Virginia set in front of her. What does Holt do when he decides the documents exist? When he stops believing I burned them? He comes here, Virginia said flatly, sitting down with her own cup. He'll know you've nowhere else to go. He comes here and he has a badge, Clara said.
He can walk through this door on any pretext. Let him walk through it, Mason said. I've got a sworn statement from Dale Purcell's incorporating attorney in Silver City. The man didn't know what Carter and Associates was being used for, and when he found out, he was not happy about it. That statement names Holt directly. He looked at Clara. And I have 6 former Kerrigan ranch hands who will testify about being ordered to move survey markers in the night. I have it all. What I needed from you was the entry structure. The proof that the accounting was designed to conceal, not just to record. You gave me that today. He paused. This case is built, Clara. We're waiting for the authority to act on it. And that authority is 2 days out. Clara turned her cup in her hands. She thought about the crock on the shelf moved 3 inches. She thought about Holt's face when he'd asked about the documents, and the stillness that had come over him when she'd said she'd burned them. She thought about the particular way his eyes had looked when he'd released her collar. Not relieved, not satisfied, but calculating. And she thought about everything she knew about how Holt Deering operated, which was more than anyone else in this room knew. More than Mason Cole with his surveys and his statements and his gray eyes. Because she had been married to this man for 5 years, and she had paid attention every single day. He already knows I'm here, she said. Both of them looked at her. When I said he believed me enough to leave, I meant he believed me enough to want me to think he believed me. Holt doesn't go out at night in the middle of a problem. He stays home and controls the perimeter. She set her cup down. He left because he wanted me to feel safe enough to move. He's watching this house right now. The kitchen went very quiet. Mason stood up without hurrying and went to the window and looked out at the dark street from the edge of the frame. The way you look when you don't want to be seen looking. He stood there for 30 seconds and came back to the table and sat down. There's a man on the far side of the street, he said, leaning against a hardware store wall. Not doing anything, just standing. That'll be Pete Reeves, Clara said. Holt's deputy. He does whatever Holt tells him without asking why. She looked at them both. He knows I'm in this house. And now that I've left his house with my things, he knows that I know enough to run. Which means the pretense is over. Virginia stood and went to the back of the house, and they heard a door open and close, and she came back in 2 minutes, her jaw set. My neighbor Thomas is home. His boy can ride. Whitmore, Mason said. 2 days is too long, Clara said. If Holt moves tonight, he won't move tonight, Mason said, and she heard something in his voice that was different from the calm certainty of the courtroom man. Something older. He'll wait for first light. Men like Holt always wait for first light. They want witnesses who remember a reasonable hour and a reasonable face. The violence is always cleaner in the morning, when everyone is awake to see how calm he was. He looked at Clara. I know that. I grew up with that schedule. Clara looked at him across Virginia's kitchen table in the lamplight and understood that they were not talking about her father's land anymore. They were talking about the specific knowledge that lives in the body of a child who learned to read the quality of morning air for what it predicted about the day. She recognized it because she had a version of it herself, worn into her from 5 years of the same education in a different house. All right, she said. First light.
She thought for a moment.
Then we need someone here who isn't just us. If Holt comes with his badge and Pete Reeves at his shoulder, Mason's word against his doesn't hold in a local court. We need witnesses he can't dismiss.
Who? Virginia said. Clara thought about Ridgefall. She thought about 5 years of watching the town look away, of Agnes Holloway's window going empty, of Herb Castleton's chair creaking and not rising. She thought about 30 people on a boardwalk and not one of them stepping off it. She thought about who in this town had watched and said nothing, and was now, after everything that had happened in the last 2 days, lying awake at night with that nothing sitting heavy on their conscience. Herb Castleton, she said. He was there both times. He saw everything, and he's been sitting with it. She paused. And Doc Hennessy. He set my broken finger 18 months ago and wrote household accident in his records. And I think he's been ashamed of it every day since.
She looked at Virginia. And if you have those 12 women you said would help quietly, now is when quiet ends. Virginia looked at her for a long moment with the iron spine expression that was as close as she got to admiration. Then she picked up her shawl from the hook by the door. I'll be back in an hour, she said. Lock this door behind me. She left. The kitchen settled around Clara and Mason, the lamp burning low between them, the clock on the wall marking the slow minutes toward morning. Outside, Pete Reeves stood against the hardware store wall and did not move. Clara listened to the town's nighttime sounds and thought about her father's photograph in the market basket, and the $32 and the gray shawl. All the pieces of a life she was going to have to build from scratch. And thought that her father had built his from scratch too, once. And he'd done it with nothing but a set of numbers in his head, and the willingness to start the column over. Are you afraid? Mason asked. Clara considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. All the way down, no shortcuts. Yes, she said. But it's different now. Before, the fear was the whole room. There was nothing else in it. She looked at the lamp. Now it's just one thing in a room that has other things in it. Mason said nothing. He didn't need to. He just stayed where he was, at the table, on the same side of it as she was, and that was enough. Outside, the night held its breath. First light was 6 hours away. Virginia came back in 53 minutes with Herb Castleton, Doc Hennessy, and 4 women Clara recognized from the quilting circle. Margaret Braddock, whose daughter Mary Ellen had whispered once and then looked away, and 3 others whose names Clara knew from 5 years of church pews and town suppers, and the particular social geography of a small place where everyone knows everything and acts like they know nothing. They filed into Virginia's kitchen without ceremony. Herb Castleton was still in his suspenders, his white hair uncombed, and he looked at Clara the way a man looks at something he should have looked at a long time ago, and didn't. Doc Hennessy set his bag on the table and sat down, and folded his hands, and didn't offer an explanation for being there, because none was necessary. Holt's man is still outside, Mason said to Virginia. I know it, Virginia said. Let him watch. Let him go back and tell Holt that Virginia Miller's house has 9 people in it, and a lamp burning. She looked around the room with the assurance of a woman who had been running her own life for 15 years, and found it suited her. Let him think about what that means. Herb Castleton cleared his throat. He was looking at Clara, and the look had something in it that was uncomfortable to see on a man his age. Not shame exactly, but its close relative. The expression of someone doing a long overdue accounting of themselves. Mrs. Deering, he started. Hale, Clara said. My name is Clara Hale. He absorbed that. Miss Hale. He tried it again, and it fit better. I've been sitting in that chair outside the barber for going on 12 years, and I have seen... He stopped. Started again. There are things I saw and didn't act on, and I am not going to stand in front of you and tell you I had good reasons, because I didn't. I had easy reasons. That's different. He looked at the table. I'll say whatever needs saying, in whatever court needs hearing it. Doc Hennessy opened his bag and took out a brown leather record book. I have documentation going back 3 years, he said. I wrote what he told me to write in the official records, but I kept my own notes. Clinical observations, dates, injuries, my assessment of cause. He set the book on the table. I should have done something with these a long time ago. Clara looked at that book and felt something move through her that was too complex to name. Gratitude and grief, and a particular kind of anger at all the time those notes had spent in a bag when they could have been doing something. She let herself feel it for 1 full second, and then she set it aside because morning was coming, and there was no time for anything that couldn't be used. Mason, she said, tell me exactly what happens when Whitmore arrives. Mason had been standing at the window at the edge of the frame for the last 10 minutes, watching the street at intervals. He came back to the table. Whitmore has federal authority to conduct an investigation into territorial land records. His arrival officially takes the case out of local jurisdiction. Once he's here, Collier can't issue injunctions, Holt can't suppress evidence, and any action Holt takes against witnesses becomes a federal obstruction charge on top of everything else. He paused. The problem is, he's not here yet. And Holt moves at first light, Clara said, which is approximately... Mason looked at the clock on Virginia's wall. 5 hours and 40 minutes from now. The room was quiet for a moment, with the specific weight of a calculation everyone in it was making simultaneously. 5 hours and 40 minutes against 2 days. That was the shape of the problem. Send for Whitmore again, Herb Castleton said. Everyone looked at him. He shrugged with the directness of an old man who decided to stop filtering himself. I've got a horse that's done 100 miles in a day before. My grandson rides better than half the men in this county. If your man Whitmore is 2 days out at his current pace, how far does he get with a fresh rider meeting him on the road and telling them the situation has changed? Mason looked at him. If he pushes through the night, he could be here by dawn. Then send the boy. Herb stood up from the table with the decisiveness of a man who'd sat still too long. I'll get him up. He'll want to do it. He's 17, and he's been bored since the last cattle drive. He looked at Clara once more, and the look was different now, cleaner. It's not much against 12 years of looking the other way, but it's what I've got tonight. He left. Virginia went with him to the door, and Clara heard them speaking in low voices, and then Virginia came back, and the kitchen rearranged itself around the remaining people with the purposeful quiet of a group that had accepted its situation and was deciding what to do inside it. Doc Hennessy opened his record book, and he and Mason spent an hour going through it page by page, Mason making notes in his survey satchel, Clara listening and occasionally providing a date or a context that matched one of the doctor's clinical entries to a specific incident she remembered from the other side of the examining table. It was the strangest hour of her life, sitting in a warm kitchen while 2 men treated the record of her suffering as evidence, which it was, which it needed to be, which did not make it easier to hear her own history read back to her in clinical notation. At one point, Margaret Braddock, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table the whole time, reached over and put her hand over Clara's. She didn't say anything. Clara looked at the hand on hers for a moment, and then she turned her palm up and held it. And that was all that needed to happen there. 2 hours before dawn, Pete Reeves was no longer outside. Mason noticed it first. He went to the window and came back to the table and looked at Clara with an expression that communicated the change without words. He went to tell him, Clara said. Or Holt called him back. If Holt called him back, it means he's decided to wait for morning and come himself. She thought about it. If Reeves went to report on his own, it means he saw the people arriving and got nervous. She looked at Mason. Either way, Holt knows this room is full, and he's adjusting his plan. "Does that make it better or worse?" one of the women from the quilting circle asked. Her name was Frances Webb, and she had a husband who also drank, and she'd told Virginia on the walk over that she'd been waiting for someone to do something about Holt Deering for 2 years, and was prepared to be that someone if required. "It makes it different," Clara said. "Holt doesn't like audiences. He's spent 5 years being very careful about what he does in front of people." She thought about Main Street, about the calculated precision of a man who knew exactly how far he could go with witnesses present, and exactly how far he went when there were none. If he comes here in the morning with 9 people watching, he'll come as the law. Badge, papers, proper authority. He'll try to make it procedural. "And if it's procedural, we need Whitmore," Mason said. "Yes." Clara looked at the clock. 4 hours. Nobody slept. Virginia made 2 more pots of coffee, and at some point produced a plate of biscuits that disappeared without anyone acknowledging they'd eaten them. Clara sat at the table with Doc Hennessy's record book open in front of her, and her father's papers in the oilcloth beside it, and Mason's survey maps spread at the end of the table, and felt the evidence accumulating, the way she'd always felt a good accounting accumulate. Each piece small in itself, but together building something that held its own weight, that couldn't be argued away, that simply was. At 4 in the morning, she went to the small room Virginia had set up off the kitchen, and lay down on the narrow cot without taking her boots off, and closed her eyes and breathed. She didn't sleep, but the lying down was its own thing, its own quiet, and she used the time the way her father had taught her to use the hours before a difficult day, going through what she knew in order, without embellishment, looking for the gaps and deciding in advance what she would say when the gaps were pressed on. She heard Mason's boots on the floor outside the door, back and forth, the slow, deliberate pacing of a man standing watch. And she thought about his mother in her different house, and his 17-year-old self who hadn't been able to do anything. And she thought that sometimes the things that break us in one life become the things we know how to do in the next. She thought about her father teaching her the columns because he had no son, and she had been enough. More than enough. Exactly enough. And she had not known until this moment, lying on a cot in Virginia Miller's side room, how much of herself she'd made from that. She got up at 5 and went back to the kitchen, and Mason was at the window again, and the first gray edge of dawn was showing at the bottom of the eastern sky. "Whitmore?" she said. "Not yet." She stood beside him at the window, and they both looked at the empty street in the early light, and neither of them spoke for a moment. And in that silence, Clara was aware of how close he was standing, and aware that she was aware of it, and that it was its own kind of information. Not urgent, not the thing that mattered right now, but real, present. A door she was not ready to walk through, but could see the outline of, the way you can see a door in the dark by the light at its edges. "When this is over," she said, and stopped. "When this is over," Mason said, and waited. "I don't know what I'm doing next," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I have $32 in my father's land if the court upholds the claim, and a set of accounting skills that I built for a man who used them against me, and I don't know yet what any of that becomes." She looked at the window. "I just want you to know that. I don't have a plan yet. I'm just at the beginning of something, and I don't know its shape." "That's all right," Mason said. "Beginnings don't need a shape yet." She looked at him. He was looking out the window, not at her, giving her the room she needed, the way he always gave her room. She thought about the step back. She thought about, "We don't have as much time as I'd like." The first time he'd said "we,"
and how it had felt like a word she'd forgotten the meaning of. "I think I'd like to learn its shape," she said carefully, without being in a hurry about it. He turned and looked at her then, and the look was direct and unhurried and contained, behind its careful surface, something warm that had been there since Main Street, and that he had been respectful enough not to press on until she was ready to acknowledge it herself. "I've got no place I need to be after this," he said, "and the Territorial Land Office could use a good accountant." Something small and alive moved in Clara's chest. Not the reckless hope of a woman with nothing left to lose. Something steadier. Something that knew its own value and was choosing, not surrendering. She was about to answer when Virginia's voice came sharp from the front of the house. "Rider coming!" They moved at the same time, through the kitchen and into the front room where Virginia stood at the window with Francis Webb behind her. Down the street, a single horse was moving at a hard canter, raising dust in the early morning light. And behind it, farther back, coming around the bend from the South Road, 2 more riders, then 4, then what looked like 7 people moving together. "That's Whitmore," Mason said, from somewhere beside her. There was something different in his voice. Not relief exactly, but the release of a breath held very long. "That's George Whitmore in front." "And the others?" Virginia said. "Herb's grandson must have met him on the road." Mason was moving toward the door. "He brought people with him. When Whitmore rides in on federal authority, he brings witnesses of his own. It's procedure. It makes the record clean." He looked back at Clara. "Stay here until he comes to the door. Let me speak to him first." "Mason," he stopped. "Together," she said. "Remember." He held her gaze for 1 second, and then he nodded and held the door open, and they walked out together onto Virginia Miller's front porch, into the thin gold of the early Ridgefall morning. George Whitmore was a compact, gray-haired man with the saddle-worn look of someone who'd spent more of his life outdoors than in, and he took in the scene on the porch. The house full of people, the 2 figures standing together in the doorway, with the quick, comprehensive attention of a man who'd seen a lot of situations and could read one fast. He dismounted and came up the walk and extended his hand to Mason first, and then to Clara. "Miss Hale," he said, and she felt her name in her father's form land squarely, used correctly, without confusion or apology. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "thank you for riding hard." "Your case gave me reason to," he said. "I've read the copies your man sent. I want to see the originals, and I want to sit down with your accounting analysis before I approach Deputy Deering." He looked at her directly. "Are you prepared to provide formal testimony?" "I've been prepared for 3 years," Clara said. "I just needed someone with the authority to take it." They went inside. The next 2 hours moved with the particular speed of things that have been building for a long time and have finally found their opening. Whitmore sat at Virginia's kitchen table with the documents spread before him and asked precise, specific questions, and Clara answered every one of them with the precision of a woman who had built the system being questioned and understood every brick of it. She walked him through the coding structure, the dual entry method, the dated sequence of transfers that corresponded to the timeline of Holt's appointment. She showed him the tax receipt and watched his expression solidify into the particular set of a man who has found the thing he was looking for. Doc Hennessy presented his record book. Whitmore read it and said nothing, but his jaw tightened in the way of a man who has learned to keep his feelings out of his work and is working to do it now. At 7:15, with the sun fully up and Ridgefall's Main Street beginning its ordinary morning activity, Holt Deering came down 2nd Street on his horse, with Pete Reeves beside him and his badge on his chest, and his face arranged in the expression of a man with legal business to conduct. He pulled up in front of Virginia's house and found 11 people on the porch. Clara stood in the center of them, with Whitmore on her left and Mason on her right,
and Herb Castleton and Doc Hennessy behind her, and 7 others behind them. And she watched Holt's face perform its rapid internal calculation, the assessment of the badge, the federal authority, the witnesses, the numbers. And she watched him arrive at the same conclusion she had arrived at, 4 years too late. The room had changed, and the math no longer worked in his favor. "Holt Deering," Whitmore said, stepping forward with a document in his hand. "I'm George Whitmore, Federal Land Inspector for the New Mexico Territory, operating under authority of the United States Territorial Court. I have a warrant for your detention, pending investigation of fraudulent land transfers, falsification of county records, and misuse of public office." He extended the document. "You can take this, or I can read it to you. Either way, the content is the same." Holt looked at the document. He looked at Whitmore. He looked at Clara. She held his gaze the way she'd held it across 5 years of kitchen tables, and she did not look away, and she did not perform anything. No triumph, no anger, no fear. She was simply a woman standing on a porch in the morning light who knew what was in a ledger and had found the authority to say so. "You think this holds?" Holt said. His voice was still controlled, but there was something new in it. A hairline fracture, the first sound of a structure under more weight than it was built for. "You think a boarding house woman and a drifter surveyor and my own wife walk into a federal court and—" "Your cousin Dale Purcell gave a sworn statement to the incorporating attorney in Silver City 6 days ago," Mason said. "The attorney provided it to Mr. Whitmore 2 days ago. Dale's already talking." The fracture widened. Holt looked at Pete Reeves. Reeves looked at the document in Whitmore's hand, and then at the 11 people on the porch. And then he looked at his boots, with the expression of a man who has just completed a calculation about his own future and found it pointed somewhere other than where he'd been standing. "I'll need your badge and your firearm," Whitmore said to Holt. "Now, please, or I'll ask one of these witnesses to assist me in taking them." Herb Castleton took 1 step forward on the porch. Just 1 step. It was enough. Holt Deering unpinned his badge with hands that were finally not steady, and set it in Whitmore's hand. And the sound it made against the federal man's palm was small and final, like the last entry in a column that has been running too long. Pete Reeves surrendered his weapon without being asked, and stood to the side with the visible relief of a man who'd been waiting for permission to stop doing something he hadn't been comfortable with for a long time. It was over. Not the legal work. That would take months. A circuit judge, formal proceedings, the slow machinery of territorial justice grinding through everything that Holt had built and built on sand. But this particular morning, this particular porch, this particular moment of Holt Deering standing in the street of his own town, with 11 witnesses and no badge and no leverage, this was over. Clara watched them take him and felt the absence of everything she'd expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not relief in the sharp way she'd imagined it. Just a slow, deep settling, like a building finding its foundation after years of standing crooked. Like a column that has finally been balanced and can be closed. Mason came to stand beside her when the street had cleared, when Whitmore had gone inside to continue his work, and Virginia had taken everyone else back into the kitchen, and the porch was quiet. He stood at the railing beside her and looked out of the street where Ridgefall was waking up. The mill starting, a wagon pulling up outside the hardware store. Agnes Holloway opening her millinery door and stopping when she saw Clara on the porch, and then, slowly, nodding, just once, before she went inside. It was a small thing. It was also not nothing. "What do you need?" Mason said. Clara thought about the question, the real question inside it, the one that asked not about logistics or legal proceedings or the next practical step.
but about something deeper, something that looked like a future. She looked at Ridge Falls Main Street and thought about her father's land east of the creek, and $32, and the set of skills that had been used against her once and could be used by her from now on. She thought about the door she'd seen in the dark, by the light at its edges, and she thought about beginnings that don't need a shape yet, but that need a direction.
She thought about what her father had told her once, standing in his office in Missouri, with a ledger open between them, when she was 12 years old and learning to run her first column. She'd asked him what to do when the numbers didn't balance, when something was wrong and she couldn't find where. He'd said, "Start from what you know is true and work forward from there. Don't guess. Don't assume. Just take the first true number and build from it." She knew some things that were true. She knew her name was Clara Hale. She knew she was standing on her own 2 feet on a porch in New Mexico territory, with the morning sun on her face, and her father's land returned in law, if not yet in fact, and the evidence of 5 years of surviving assembled into something that would hold up in court. She knew there was a man beside her who'd crouched in the dirt of a street she'd been knocked into, and offered his hand and then stepped back and given her room, who had made one mistake she'd corrected and hadn't made it again, who understood the specific grammar of households where silence was a survival strategy, because he'd grown up learning it himself. Those were true numbers. She could build from those. "I need coffee," she said, "and then I need to sit down with Whitmore and walk him through the complete accounting structure. Every account I touched in 5 years. Because I know where everything is buried, and he's going to need all of it." She paused. And after that, she turned and looked at Mason Cole in the morning light with the full directness she'd been learning to use again since Monday, since a man had held out his hand in the dirt and waited without grabbing. "After that, I'd like to have supper with someone who doesn't need me to be anything other than what I am." Mason looked at her, and the warmth behind his gray eyes came forward, unhurried, exactly the right pace. "I know a place," he said. "Nothing fancy, but the coffee's good." "I've had enough fancy," Clara said. "Fancy was never mine anyway." She turned and walked back through Virginia's door into the kitchen, where the work was waiting, where Whitmore had his papers spread, and Doc Hennessy was reviewing dates, and Francis Webb was writing things down in a careful hand. And the lamp was still burning, even though the morning had made it unnecessary. And she sat down at the table and opened the column from the first true number, and began to work forward from there. Outside, Ridgefall went on. The mill ran, the wagons moved, the street filled with the ordinary sounds of a town doing its ordinary business, indifferent as ever to the specific shape of any one woman's life. But Clara Hale was not invisible anymore. She was not silent anymore. She was not surviving anymore. She was living, eyes open, name intact, future unfolding in front of her like a ledger with clean pages. And no one, not ever again, was going to write in it but her.